This is Will Inboden. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Texas National Security Review, and welcome to a new episode of our Horns of a Dilemma podcast. We are recording this here on the University of Texas at Austin campus. Exciting week here on campus. The classes are about to start. Students rolling in, moving into their dorms. Football team toiling away on the practice field. We're excited, hopefully, for a good season for the Longhorns. And we're here to talk about cybersecurity, Senator Sasse's new Cyber Solarium Commission, and the history of the Eisenhower administration's Solarium project, and what insights from that history can be learned for the present day. I've got a great team of colleagues here with me for this discussion. We're going to do some introductions right now. Celeste, why don't we start with you?
Great. Thank you very much, Will. I'm Celeste Ward Gventer. I'm the Associate Director of the Clement Center for National Security.
And I'm Bobby Chesney. I'm the Director of the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law and a faculty member at the Law School at UT.
This is Steve Slick. I'm a professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs here at the University of Texas, Austin, and also lead the Clement Strauss Intelligence Studies Project.
Will Inboden here again. In addition to my editor role with the Texas National Security Review, I'm also the executive director of the Clement Center for National Security and a professor at the LBJ School. So to give a little bit of context before we start diving into our discussion, Solarium, I've found in my work in national security policy and history, is oft-cited but little understood. And Celeste in a minute is going to give us some more background on what the Solarium project actually was and why it might be a helpful model for strategic planning today. But to give some historical context, one reason why President Eisenhower set up Solarium the way he did is he realized on taking office in 1953 that he was in uncharted territory. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet dictator, had just died. This is the first time the United States was first time in decades we're facing a Soviet Union without Stalin as the leader. Eisenhower inherited a mushrooming and he thought unsustainable defense budget, a bit of a quagmire in the Korean War. Soviet Union had recently detonated its first atomic device. The United States had just developed the first hydrogen bomb, thermonuclear weapon. So you've now got an emerging great power contest, an ideological war in the Cold War between two nuclear powers. And the question is, what do we do about this? And so to address that, President Eisenhower set up the Solarium exercise. So Celeste, why don't you tell us a little bit about what that exactly entailed?
Sure. Thanks, Will. I'll just very quickly cover what Eisenhower was trying to do and why he set up Solarium. Early on in the administration, they were confronting this challenge of what should our grand strategy be. They had the strategy that was set out in NSC 68, which was the essential containment policy that we're all familiar with. But essentially, which direction should we go from here? And in a meeting in May of 1953 with a bunch of his key advisors, the Dulles brothers, his national security advisor, Robert Cutler, and a few others, they were actually sitting in the White House in the Solarium, which is a room in the White House. And Eisenhower suggested that an analytical process should be started to look at alternative courses of action. And so he suggested the formation of 3 different teams to look at 3 different strategic alternatives, and thus was born Project Solarium.
Great. Thank you, Celeste. We'll be talking a little bit more about what exactly they did with Solarium and how it might be relevant today. So we mentioned that Senator Sasse sponsored the inclusion in the recently passed NDAA, creating a new cyberspace Solarium commission. And Bobby is going to tell us a little bit more about what's in that and how it works. But I should note that the recently passed National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, is named after Senator McCain. He, of course, is the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee and did so much to get this particular legislation passed and enacted into law. And it is fitting that we mention him today as we're recording this on Friday afternoon. The news just came out this morning about his rapidly declining health, and he's suspending any further treatments for his cancer. So it's especially poignant, I think, that we are talking about such a major piece of legislation that he was a part of getting across and is named after him. And even though it's clear he won't be with us much longer, this will be one part of his very consequential legacy. So it's an honor for all of us to be talking about that today. So Bobby, turning to you, tell us about what exactly is in this Cyberspace Solarium Commission, what it's going to do, what do we need to know about it?
Okay, so Section 1652 of the John McCain NDAA, which originates with Senator Sasse, is basically forming a commission, a national commission to examine national strategy in relation to defending America in cyberspace. The language at the front of the statute as enacted that describes its particular charge is this: to develop a consensus, quote, on a strategic approach to defending the United States in cyberspace against cyber attacks of significant consequence. So the basic idea is there's going to be a group with the following membership: the Principal Deputy DNI, the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the FBI Director, and then 3 people that will be picked by the Senate Majority Leader in consultation with the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Of those 3, 1 will be a senator, 2 cannot be. And then a similar model with 2 picks for the Senate Minority Leader. Again, 1 senator, 1 not. And so 5 total picked via the Senate, 2 of whom will be senators. And then the same thing on the House side. So you end up with that membership. And then from that membership, with input from the president, you have to select bipartisan chairs, a Republican and a Democrat to co-chair. And so maybe a more familiar model people will look to is say that looks a lot like the 9/11 Commission, that sort of format. Of course, there will be staff members too, and we all know how that works. The staff will be doing a lot of the groundwork. Those members have to be picked within 45 days of the signing of the John McCain Act into law, which happened a Monday a week ago. So I think that makes September 27th the deadline. I'm not exactly a math major, so I probably screwed that up. But September 27th seems to be when the members have to be named. And then they must have their initial meeting within 60 days total, which puts the first meeting of the Cyber Solarium Commission in mid-October. So what are they going to do? I described the basic charge, but the statute actually goes on to spell out in considerable, somewhat overlapping detail exactly what they're supposed to look into. So under the general heading of cyber defense, if you will, they've got to consider the following things. First, pros and cons or cost and benefits of the various competing strategic options or strategy frameworks for defending America in this setting. And that includes in reference to defending specifically the political system, sectors of private infrastructure that pertain to national security, and I think very interestingly, the, quote, innovation base of the United States, the ideas and the companies and so forth. And in academia, I would throw in there as well, I think is included. And they're supposed to consider, among other things, deterrence as a framework, norms-based regimes as a framework, and, quote, active disruption of adversary attacks through persistent engagement. And then the list kind of goes on, and I'm going to distill it down to keep it simple. There's a lot of overlap. Other things that the commission needs to consider: what about those norms-based regimes? What exactly should the norms be that the United States should support? This is interesting. How much damage should the United States be willing to incur in pursuit of a deterrence and persistent denial strategy? And of course, what's lurking beneath the hood there is this notion that it's all great to talk about imposing deterrence on others, but deterrence is at least a 2-player game, and there's a cost that comes back at you, and there's risk of escalation and so forth. So thinking through what that might entail and how much risk we really ought to be able to take on is quite important. What else? When do hostile cyber activities, what's described here simply as attacks, when do they actually warrant a response? And how exactly can we best go about doing this? There's some further matters about the commission becoming informed about how much do we really understand about our adversaries' strategies, capabilities, and intentions in this area. How good is our system for finding these things out? Can that be improved? How good is our system for actually determining whether we're being effective? And do we need new structures or authorities to respond in a more effective way than we have been doing?
And that's quite a bit. That's a very ambitious mandate addressing a lot of the really key strategic questions. And as Bobby reminded us in walking through the timetable there, this is a fast train leaving the station. So the executive branch, the congressional leadership are going to be making decisions in the next few weeks about who the commissioners are, the ones that are not statutorily mandated, and then the commission is going to be meeting soon thereafter. So, Steve, with that, I want to turn to you because before becoming a professor here and running the Intelligence Studies Project, you, of course, spent 28 years as a case officer with CIA, including an intelligence leadership position on the NSC. So you've been in this business for a while from a number of different vantage points, and you've written very thoughtfully about a message in particular to the leaders of the intelligence community on why they should take this commission seriously and why they should embrace it and work with it. Can you tell us a little bit more about that from the IC vantage point?
Sure. Thank you, Will. I'll try to be brief in summarizing this, but I dropped a commentary last week in War on the Rocks that probably does a better job of explicating my thoughts on this. My message was principally directed to the intelligence community. It's obviously the case that they don't spend nearly as much time there monitoring the defense authorization bill as they do the intelligence authorization bill as it comes out of the House, the HPSI, and the Senate, the SISI side. So I wanted to make sure that this was on their screens at a leadership level so they're aware that this was coming and encourage them, frankly, to embrace it and not treat it as an unnecessary burden. Now, for those of you who've ever worked around the relationships between the Congress and these executive agencies, you may not be familiar with the concept of CDAs, or congressionally directed actions. Here's the short version of this. So each year, these 1,000-page bills authorizing expenditures by the intelligence community and the Defense Department come out of the Congress. And invariably, they include dozens and dozens of congressionally directed actions. These usually are statistical reports, qualitative reports, pieces of information, or other activities that the Congress would like the intelligence community to undertake, which is all fine and good because that's actually their role. They need information to do their jobs, and it's appropriate that they ask for it. The problem is that they never actually go back and cull through these annual reports. And so the consequences over decades is that there are hundreds and hundreds of these lengthy statistical reports owed to the Congress each year, and they're flowing through the Director of National Intelligence's office, as well as the CIA director and the FBI director. They take an enormous amount of time on the part of the leaders who want to get the facts straight. And so they could be excused at Liberty Crossing at the office of the DNI if they looked at this and just sighed and thought, this is another burden, another report, put it on the stack of CDAs. I think that would be wrong in this case, and I made an effort to explain why. I think the intelligence community has a particular handful of reasons why they should care about this commission's work and why they should support it and help it to succeed. The first one is just a very practical consideration, and that is this commission can't do its work without access to the information and the expertise that resides in the intelligence community. So guess what? The states and the non-state actors who are attacking us thousands of times a day, making attacks and intrusions against our networks, go to considerable trouble to conceal their identities, to conceal what they're doing and how they're doing it and what they plan to do next. So what we know about all of this, and the facts do matter in a case like this, and what we know about it is largely in the databases and in the heads of the experts in the intelligence community at NSA, at the Defense Department, at CIA. And so it's simply a case that this commission can't hold its policy debate about these alternative strategic options that Bobby described unless they know the facts. The facts reside with our intelligence community. And there's also an interesting connection back to Project Solarium in 1953 that Celeste was describing. In that case, there's actually a good bit of scholarship a couple of years ago that I found interesting that demonstrated that the intelligence community, CIA in particular, was central to the success of the original Project Solarium. So the leaders of the intelligence community...
For our listeners, that's a CIA homer taking credit once again for just about everything good that's happened in American foreign policy history. Sorry.
This only worked.
Steve.
This only worked because of the contributions of the CIA. Now, the fact of the matter is the leaders of the intelligence community helped design the process, hand in glove with President Eisenhower. There were experts from the intelligence community assigned to each of the groups that was arguing on behalf of a given policy. And they actually generated a series of written products, national intelligence estimates and special national intelligence estimates, that created a common factual foundation on which the different groups could debate and advocate on behalf of their policy options. So I would argue that's the approach the intelligence community ought to take to this Cyber Solarium Commission. They should want them to succeed, make the information and the experts available, even though these are busy people and have other things to do. The other reason why I think it'd be particularly useful for the intelligence community to get involved. I call the incomplete warning problem. So one of the reasons we have such a large, expensive, well-staffed intelligence community is to provide warning to our elected and appointed officials of threats that are confronting the United States. And by our doctrine, that warning's not complete by simply telling policymakers about a danger. Rather, it's not complete until policymakers actually understand, take action, and address the threat. So my argument is that the intelligence community's job isn't done in this case simply by warning, which they have been doing for well over a decade now, about the threat or the vulnerability we faced in our cyber networks, but rather they need to be persistent about this, stay after the policymakers. In this regard, I'd say Director Coates has been particularly forceful in recent weeks. He mentioned this as his number one priority in his worldwide threat testimony, and then he went out a few weeks later and in a private setting, speaking to the public, discussed the fact, actually he used Director George Tenet's expression from the pre-9/11 warning structures, that the system was blinking red.
That was his speech at the Hudson Institute, right?
Exactly right. Yeah. Where he used the blinking red metaphor. And so he's been very insistent on it. But frankly, my argument is that the job's not done until the policymakers actually take action on this. And so I think this is a good opportunity, although it's a policy-making process, something the intelligence community doesn't naturally gravitate to. It's nonetheless something they should wade into because they're going to be one of the principal beneficiaries of a clear declarative policy in this area. There are other arguments, but I've taken enough time on this.
Excellent, Steve. Very helpful. We're going to turn to Celeste now because Senator Sasse, in coming up with this idea, he himself is a student of history, and I know that he wanted to create the Solarium tie-in for a couple of reasons. One is because it was largely a successful exercise and can be a model for effective strategic planning that leads to effective implementation, and Celeste will talk about that. But second, there's the branding part of it, is he knows that it is widely seen even today as a successful exercise, and hopefully that can help draw the attention of others to this and say, here's an opportunity to do a 21st century version of that. But Celeste, we're going to turn it over to you now. Tell us a little bit more about why Solarium was seen as a success in Eisenhower's day. What were its successes? And of course, we know nothing's perfect, maybe what some of its deficiencies were as well. So over to you.
Well, I think one of the things that really struck me about what Steve said is about taking this process seriously, both the intelligence community and the policy community. And I think that's why the branding of Solarium is actually so important here, even if there are differences with the actual Solarium process. As you said, it's seen as such a significant event in history that it will get people's attention a bit better than just another congressionally directed action or another report requested by Congress or another commission. And so I think that was wise to put that branding and to signal thus its significance.
A couple years ago when UT wasn't doing too well on the football field, I thought we needed a Solarium for the football team even, right? It's kind of the catch-all that fixes everything, right? So anyway.
It's not too late.
Hey,
and
we're undefeated so far. It's August.
So far. I think it's seen as a successful process for a number of reasons, not only for the substance that emerged from it, which I think a lot of people have argued Eisenhower already knew the answer that he wanted to get to from the start. But what it really did was it brought along the community, and in this case, the process was secret, so it wasn't really the public, but it brought along the agencies and a lot of his key officials who, not all of whom had a lot of national security experience. And in fact, John Foster Dulles, his Secretary of State, had been far more hawkish. And so it had the effect of bringing Dulles into sort of Eisenhower's point of view. And so it was very helpful in that sense. And I think that's one reason why people see it as a successful exercise.
So it kind of set Eisenhower's national security team up for a good working relationship.
Exactly.
And for success. Okay.
Right. So they practiced working together. That was one thing. And then they also sort of all got on the same page. And that allowed them to then take that basic strategy and implement it in their respective agencies. And so this is why I think a lot of people see it as the most coherent, it's often called the most coherent grand strategy the United States has ever had because of this process. Even though it was only a 6-week long process, it actually came out with answers that were clear enough.
Excellent. Great. So, and that, of course, will be one of the challenges for the new commission that is being set up very soon is, can it do its work effectively, not just in terms of coming up with ideas, but creating stakeholders across the interagency who, once the ideas are developed, can play a key role in implementing them well together. So, which does bring us back around to the current commission. Bobby, tell us, what do you think it's going to take for this commission to work to be seen as a success? I mean, what are some of the indicators you're going to be looking for as it's doing its work, and especially once the final report is issued? And Celeste and Steve, we're going to want to hear from you on this question too. What's it going to take for this thing to work?
So the first indicator I think to look for will be in the selection of the members. Obviously, there are some that are already pre-designated, and there's some who will be members of Congress, but there will be some who are coming from outside. For this particular topic, that's more critical than it would have been back in 1953 for the original Solarium, because we're talking about a domain, the control over which and the roots of American power in relation to it, and especially the vulnerabilities, are substantially in the hands of the private sector as well. And there's just a different balance of interest between the public and the private sectors on the cyber domain than there was with respect to the Cold War confrontation. So what you're looking for then is the sort of very difficult needle they need to thread, where they bring in people who are able to speak, and there's not that many slots here, but they're able to speak with some credibility about the perspective of the information industry, if you will, in the United States, and the many competing interests that are there is going to make that alone hard. But having people who can speak credibly from that external perspective and joining the process, if the selections seem to reflect the right level of seriousness and expertise, that's a great start. If instead the selections look like people who are really only going to come at this with the same perspectives that, say, FBI and DOD and others are going to bring to bear anyways, it's going to overhang the process a little bit and make it harder for the overall credibility of the end result to receive as much attention as it might merit on the substance. So then the next thing to look for will be there will only be some parts of this will be visible to the public, but does it look like they're holding hearings and hearing from people that represent these broad perspectives? Does it look like, for those who follow different slices of the issue, that they're in fact debating things not at the, hey, let's admire this problem in general level, but instead getting down into the weeds, taking advantage of all the immense amount of thinking that's actually already been going on for more than a decade on these topics in different sort of siloed ways? That'll be a good sign as well if they're avoiding that problem. Then last, of course, is the end result. The proof will be in the pudding in September of 2019. September 1st is the deadline for the commission to deliver its report to the president and to various congressional committees and to the stakeholding Secretary of Defense, Homeland Security, and others. That report, we can all imagine, could easily be kept at a high level of generality that is just yet another report describing how there are tough trade-offs to be had, et cetera, pros and cons for the different frameworks, got to do a little bit of everything, get better at everything, try harder, everybody. That's not really a contribution. The fundamental problem, and I imagine some listeners right now are thinking, haven't we been thinking about this for a long time? Don't we have lots of people at DOD who think about this? Don't we have lots of people at various institutions of government who think about this? Certainly so. What's the real need that's being addressed here? We've been admiring this problem from different perspectives for a long time. DOD has been thinking about it. Others have been thinking about it. But what we unfortunately currently seem to lack is a sustained commitment that really normally could only come from the White House and the National Security Council sort of apparatus to bridge across the interagency to force people who each have their own equities, each have their own capacities, each have their own perspectives, to integrate all that and to think about where the hard trade-offs need to be made about when the next incident of the following kind happens, just how far are we willing to go in response, and what could we do now to set ourselves up to have better options when that moment comes. Because of some personnel changes, because of a lot of stuff that we all read about in the news, there's not a lot of reason to think that the executive branch right now at this moment is well positioned to drive a process like that. The last administration did not drive effectively a process like that either, although they did a lot of good work in building towards the place we're at. There were flaws then as well. So this isn't meant to be, and I hope it's not a partisan point in any way. It's just an observation about the failure of both the Obama and the Trump administrations to have driven this train far enough themselves. So what we ultimately are looking for here is a process that really seems to do that sort of legwork in bridging across the different perspectives that different parts of our government have and parts of the private sector, and can pull it all together in the form of a report that has real, concrete, honest to goodness, granular recommendations about what sort of new statutes we might need, what sorts of new funding. Should we abolish that agency or disempower that one and give all of its power to this one? And how do we right size for this new age that we're in?
Yeah. No, very helpful, Bobby. That's, I hope our listeners were taking careful notes there, because all of us as concerned citizens and practitioners and scholars are going to be watching this carefully and want to know, how do we evaluate if this thing is working or not? We're going to hear from Steve in a second a little bit more on what to be looking for on the deliverables and how this commission will function. But I wanted to chime in because, Bobby, your point about this being a congressional initiative is really important. And I'll speak here as a recovering policymaker myself. Worked a few years as a congressional staff member, and then worked a few years in the executive branch too. And one thing I was struck by in both is just kind of the mutual disdain, the mutual contempt that those two of our three branches of government have for each other. When I was on the Hill, we thought all those people at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue are all a bunch of idiots, and that's why they need our congressional oversight. And then when I was at State or the NSC at the White House, everyone up on the Hill are a bunch of idiots. Those clowns need to get out of our business and let the professionals do their work. Of course, our bureaucratic narcissism there kind of proves the founding fathers' wisdom in setting up different branches of government to hold each other accountable and draw on their respective strengths. I was talking to Philip Zellico recently, known to many of us, the former executive director of the 9/11 Commission, a great policymaker and scholar, and he made the point that sometimes the most important and enduring and consequential national security reforms in our country's modern history have been initiated by Congress. The 1947 National Security Act, there's obviously executive branch buy-in there, but that was Congress. Goldwater-Nichols, 1986, of course, the classic one for Defense Department reorganization. The 9/11 Commission, which of course led to the creation of the ODNI and so on and so forth. And so Congress has a really important role to play on this historically. And again, I think Senator Sasse was mindful of that. But that's also why our message to our executive branch friends who are going to be a part of implementing this is, please set aside, at least in part your disdain for Congress and give this a chance, because you could be a part of something really historic. But what that historic will be remains to be seen. And Steve's going to tell us a little bit more about what it'll take for this to work.
I was thinking about some of the challenges that the chairwomen of this committee may confront as they start organizing the work. And I guess what I'd like to agree violently with my colleague Bobby and go back to the preamble of the provision in legislation that created this commission, where they used the word consensus. The ultimate goal is consensus. So that acknowledges that we have understood this problem reasonably well for a decade and a half. And as Bobby says, maybe we're guilty of admiring it rather than addressing it head on. But the fact of the matter is there have been policies, there have been presidential statements during the Bush administration, during the Obama administration, and the current administration has said and written some things that purport to be policies. And there are a lot of sincere, hardworking, patriotic people who have worked on those. Similarly, legislators. There have been a number of members of Congress have introduced thoughtful legislation, in particular about information sharing between the public and private sectors. And then the private sector on its own has been organizing to the extent they're able, by sector and otherwise. So it's not a question of no work having been done in this area. Rather, it's a lack of a societal consensus on how to regard the problem and how to respond to it. And if this commission could accomplish anything, I would argue it should be to try to deepen that consensus. Now, this is a process. It's not likely that one commission examination, one report is going to bring our society together on how to deal with challenges of the digital age. But if they can move in that direction and fairly reflect some of the interests of the executive branch, of the legislative branch, of state, local, and tribal entities, and of the private sector, that would be a major accomplishment. The other challenge that I foresee that potentially could derail, frankly, the work of this commission, and I hope it doesn't, is the relationship with the executive branch. The policy making around a national security threat like this is a core responsibility of the president. That's not to diminish or degrade the role of the Congress because they have one. But the fact of the matter is this is the president's job, and his administration has to protect us from these threats. Yet, other than naming some sub-cabinet level officials to be members of this commission, there's no obvious tie-in to the president and his West Wing staff and the National Security Council. Now, obviously, the Congress can't order that the president participate in any certain way or that the National Security Council, the president's staff, participate in exercise like this. But it seems to me it will be very important for at least the co-chairman of this commission to have some sort of relation, some dialogue with the executive branch of the administration. Ultimately, the president has to own these ideas and this strategy and want to execute it. And whether that happens at an NSC to staff level or in some more formalized structure, it would be a mistake for the commission to go off on its congressional mandate, conduct its work, file a report, and have no sense of buy-in or investment by the current administration, because ultimately the president is going to have to make decisions in this area, and we'd like for him to consider the report of this commission to be thoughtful, balanced, bipartisan, and constructive. And they're probably going to have to do that in a very quiet way, because as Bobby alluded to, this administration has not appeared to assign a high priority to developing and implementing a coherent cyber policy. In fact, looking back several months ago, they dismissed the Homeland Security Advisor and the cyber coordinator in the White House, both highly respected professionals, with the argument that this can be handled at a lower NSC staff level more efficiently. I actually think that's highly, highly dubious, but that's how they're approaching it. So it will be incumbent on the commission to reach out, build some bridges, build some channels of communication so they're not working in isolation from the president on this.
Those are all excellent points, Steve, and I agree with both what Steve said and what Bobby has said. I just want to identify a couple of potential pitfalls of how the commission could perhaps not contribute as much as it can and should. One would be to simply change organization in the hopes that assigning somebody responsibility for this task will allow the task to be completed. I think that's a temptation for a lot of commissions. And I think it's an American tendency to reorganize to solve a problem. And I'm struck by when you look at the terms of reference of the Solarium project given to all of the teams, one of the questions, the second question, 2A, for the teams was, what general results are expected to be accomplished by the proposed policy over what general time period? And I think that that's such an important question, and the commission really should take that on. What is it that what you're proposing is actually going to accomplish and over what time period? I also think that a successful thing that they could do that we haven't discussed yet is not only establish what we do know, but what we don't know. And so there's also another interesting question in the terms of reference of the original Solarium Commission here. Are the proposed actions based upon well-established facts as regards our own capabilities and those of the adversary? What additional studies must be initiated? So in addition to gaining consensus and understanding what we do know, we can also identify where we have real gaps in information and how we can fill them.
What we might call, or what a former Secretary of Defense would call, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns.
There you go.
And I would add that's another particular benefit for the intelligence community in this case. In that circle, these are known as requirements. And so if a firm set of requirements grew out of a process like this, well, that's mana for the intelligence community, because we have an unusual intelligence community in that it's directed by policy officials and does not make its own decisions on what to collect and where to invest its efforts. Rather, it's supposed to be working at the behest of policymakers. So if they can come away from this exercise, meaning my intelligence community colleagues, with a firm set of requirements where they can focus their collection and analytic activities, that would be a tremendous benefit.
I want to bring in another historical insight here, which I'm then going to tee up Bobby to riff on for a little bit. And that is, I'm struck at looking in history, oftentimes the pattern is there will be a technological innovation and then a lag, and then scholars and theorists catch up and figure out what it all means. By which, so take, again, the first atomic detonation is 1945, then, the first thermonuclear detonation a few years later. But it's not till later in the 50s and 60s that the nuclear theorists come around, the Herm Kahns, the Tom Schellings, the Al Wolsteaders at Rand and other places, to develop, very sophisticated deterrence theory and things like that on how can we actually use this breathtaking new technology for national security purposes. Seems like we might be in a similar vein here with cyber, where the technology, of course, has been around for a while and is rapidly increasing, but strategists, policymakers are still struggling to keep pace and figure out what this all means and how do we build a deterrence framework and so on and so forth. Of course, that's a big part of what this commission's going to be addressing. But Bobby, I know that you with your cyber strategy initiative have been really doing some pioneering work on this. And what, I guess, open-ended question, what do you as a scholar and as a strategist think that you and your fellow scholars might be able to bring to bear, maybe even in helping to advise the commission so that our strategic thinking can catch up to our technology?
Will, I think you're right that there is, it's a famous point among academics that technological disruptive change will occur, and it takes a long time, and it varies how long, for policymaking and lawmaking, which is the context I usually hear it, to catch up. And you're also right to say that we've had the technological foundations for the current predicament, if you will, in place for a while here, and we are living through that moment where policymakers are increasingly paying attention to this. Lawmakers are increasingly paying attention to it. It does seem like of late things have accelerated, and you might ask, what's the tipping point? What has happened here? And I think what has happened is we're beginning to see examples of the cost of inattention and of failing to yet figure out how to best defend ourselves that can no longer be ignored. And we're seeing it across many domains. There's no question in my mind that the Russian interference in the 2016 election, and then the belated broader public recognition that, there's also been similar things going on for some time with the Russians and closer neighbors of theirs, has been a real eye-opener. The North Korean attack on Sony was a big eye-opener that was in many ways farcical to the way the story was told in public. Well, it involved a Seth Rogen movie, and it was all just so ridiculous. And that was enough to draw people's attention and make them really pay attention and see just the extent to which what you've got here is a blurring of the line that used to sort of separate the state versus state, hostile, below the threshold of war, covert action type activities from the private sector. Sony Pictures Entertainment didn't used to think of itself as having a lot to worry about in that respect. But if what happened to Sony could happen to other people, that will certainly get their attention. It's obvious that it could. I think also persistent expressions of concern by those who are in the know about the vulnerability of our industrial control systems, whether that's the energy sector, whether it's things like transportation networks, telecommunication networks. That's been kind of a steady drumbeat, but it does feel like perhaps because of sensitization that's been created by the Russian interference and the Sony example and a few other high-profile examples, suddenly that's breaking through. Perhaps even to a point where we're overlearning the lesson. There's a risk of panic here. In any event, we've had some public learning that's going on. What else has changed is that our adversaries have had some learning too. And our various adversaries have increasingly realized that there does appear to be quite a bit they can get away with that's quite harmful to us. And the potential consequences so far don't appear to be that painful for them. The proof's in the pudding there. The attacks keep coming. And so you can have the reverse of deterrence. I don't know if you want to call that encouragement. I'm sure there's an academic term for it. But the failure of deterrence, when it becomes something that when weakness or perceived weakness begins to invite aggression.
Weakness is provocative.
Yes, exactly so. And so I think we're seeing that play out, and it's forcing all of our attention to this.
Again, coming back to history, we also see that sometimes profound strategic shocks are what it takes to catalyze the political will for major strategic innovations. Of course, Pearl Harbor, and then that leading to the 1947 National Security Act, and then 9/11, of course, being the other one. And with the examples Bobby mentioned, in some ways, maybe on a different scale, we've already had a few of these cyber Pearl Harbors with the Russian information warfare against us with the Sony hack by the North Koreans. Hopefully, nothing nearly as costly as Pearl Harbor or 9/11. And lives lost and damage to the infrastructure. But, those were our wake-up calls, I think, and I hope. It's Celeste chiming in.
Just a quick point on this. I think in part, what has slowed our thinking on this, maybe you could argue, is that precisely we haven't had a strategy. And you brought up Wohlstetter and Kahn and those guys. And one of the things that motivated them was precisely disagreement with Eisenhower's strategy, right? They disagreed with massive retaliation, and that actually provoked them to look more closely at these questions. And so, in a sense, by someone articulating a strategy, perhaps through this commission, it will actually provoke intellectuals to start looking harder at the questions, and maybe just that we haven't had one hasn't had that effect yet.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a thought here on the dimension of time. I was thinking back to some reading I did on the Eisenhower-Solarium Commission, and actually one of the central questions that they addressed was, is time on our side in this bilateral competition with the Soviet Union? They had to understand, if time passes and the conditions don't change, does this work for us, or is this a problem for us? We have something similar going on here, it seems to me. We've talked about how long the problem's been understood on one level, and we're frankly still debating right now, the right structures, the right approaches and processes for dealing with attacks and efforts to steal our intellectual property and penetrate and conduct espionage in our systems. Well, frankly, we've moved beyond that, or at least our adversaries have, to the extent that now we're not worried about attacks. We're looking at Russians who are seeking to influence our political system and the way we view ourselves and the way we regard one another. And my guess is, it's not a particularly bold prediction, but while we're still talking about this, we're going to find people start manipulating data. And Bobby's done some really interesting writing and research on that. I think that's going to open an entirely new dimension of hazard and risk. And so we're still talking about attacks, how to respond to attacks. We're moving through a phase of influence operations, and my guess is we're going to get to data manipulation before we even get ourselves organized. So Senator Sasse is absolutely right. We are behind the curve on this, and time is not on our side.
So, Steve, I especially appreciate you bringing up time and whether time is on our side or not. I agree, it's probably not. And of course, we also don't have a whole lot more time for our podcast here. So I'm going to put the final question to my three partners here, and it's this. We're still pretty early on with our Horns of a Dilemma podcast, but I think we're all very committed to 5 years from now, on August 24th, 2023. Hopefully, we'll be sitting around recording, the umpteenth episode of Horns of a Dilemma to our, million some or 10 million listeners. So the question is, 5 years from now, when we're doing this again, if you were to look back on the Cyber Solarium Commission and what its outputs were, 5 years from now, how will you judge whether it was a success or not? What will you be looking for to see if this thing worked or not? And what will be the fruits of Senator Sasse's efforts here? So, Bobby, let's start with you, then we'll do Celeste and Steve.
Well, I actually want to point to what Celeste just said a moment ago. I think that if we look back at in the battle of ideas over what our cyber security posture should be as a nation, if we look back at the report of the commission and say that placed a marker on some certain blend of the following tools that should be readily available and used under the following set of conditions, and then all the debate going forward ends up being reactive to that, and then building off of that to go off in new directions, but marking an end of this interminable phase we've been in which we talk about, gosh, what are the norms that should govern this space? Or, how do we should think about adapting nuclear deterrence theory to this. Those discussions have been going on ad nauseum for so many years, and it does feel like we just keep having the same debates and discussions. So I'd like to mark the success of the commission by its ability to make a break in the flow of ideas that sets us off in a new and hopefully much more coherent direction.
Yes, I agree with that, of course. And I guess I'll just make one final point, hopefully related to your question. And that is, I think, of course, cyber is very important. But as Steve just alluded to, it's not just about cyber per se, right? We're facing, call it hybrid warfare, call it gray zone, whatever today's new label is. But cyber is part of a larger effort on the part of our adversaries to affect information, to affect attitudes, and essentially get at us and our allies in ways that are indirect. And so one of the things the commission can do, and we'll know if it's successful if it does, is bring our understanding not only of cyber, but how cyber interacts with those other factors, and we're dealing better with these threats more broadly. I think that will mark a success.
Yeah, I don't want to at all sound or end on a pessimistic note at all, but I'd simply say it's too early to say. I think this is really a challenge of leadership and a challenge of execution. I believe in one of Bobby's posts in Lawfare, they pointed out the potential of a commission like this to contribute significantly to our policy development process. But there's some hurdles ahead, and the only way to clear them is going to be through enlightened, bipartisan leadership and serious, conscientious, professional, fact-based investigation. And I agree with Bobby. It would be terrific at the end of the day if we broke out of the pattern. And there have been a series of commissions. Very serious people have met and had very earnest discussions and issued very thoughtful reports on cybersecurity. But we need to break out of that and really generate some new thinking. And so this is a challenge to the co-chairmen, co-chairwomen of the commission and the 13 members of the commission, to do their job seriously. And if they generate good work, I'm sure it will have impact.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Steve. And a message to all the named commissioners and the soon-to-be named commissioners. Please know you've got some friends here in Austin, Texas who are going to be enthusiastically cheering you on, available to support and help you, and happy to critique your work from the sidelines as well. So thanks to our listeners, thanks to my fellow conversation partners, and thanks especially to our production wizard, Elizabeth Dowdy, who has made all this possible. So stay tuned for upcoming podcasts from Horns of a Dilemma. Thank you very much.